So this afternoon I'm going to talk to you about the incredible life of the pied flycatcher. So this is a bird that I've been familiar with really since the late 1990s. As Annie was talking now, I was figuring out what proportion of my life I've been studying pied flycatchers, and it's approximately half of my life I've just worked out. So initially that was as a volunteer at Yarner Wood, where Andy met me. And over the years, I've been able to make a bit of a career out of it, if you like. And in more sort of recent times, the work I've been doing on the species been done under the hats of the RSPB, where I work currently as a conservation scientist in the Centre for Conservation Science, where I work on other migratory birds and other things too. And under the hat of Exeter University, where I am an honorary fellow and supervise Fraser Bell, whose work features in this. And under piedfly.net, which is a monitoring network which I set up over 10 years ago, which I'll tell you a little bit about as well. Firstly, I realised the audience I have here, I realise is probably quite mixed. So hopefully there's something that's taught for everybody. But firstly, of course, I should introduce the bird to you. It's a small passerine bird, small songbird, weighs about 12, 13 grams. Here you've got the female on the left, which is perhaps largely brown, pale underneath, but notice it's got the black wing and white wing bar. The male, which is singing there on the right, is more black and white, hence its name, pied. The important thing about this bird is that it is migratory. So what you see at the top of the screen there is the breeding range. It's a common bird throughout Europe, breeding in all the boreal forests of the northern hemisphere. You see the UK there. In the UK, it's found and breeds in the west, so that's generally in the oak-dominated woodlands, tending to be a bit higher up along the west of the country. But you see that it winters so the whole species winters across that band of central and western Africa. I'll be talking quite a lot in this talk about their migration. In the UK then, they're found primarily in oak-dominated woodlands. Actually, across the rest of their range, you find them commonly in more mixed woodlands too, but I suspect our coniferous forests in this country are too much of a commercial monocrop culture to have enough nest sites and food. So in the UK, they prefer, this would be their sort of preferred habitat, if you like. Here we've got a very nice piece of woodland. It is at the height of the breeding season when the bluebells are out. And you can see in this picture a mature oak tree, which will probably contain a hole, and these are hole nesting birds, so they need holes to breed. And you can see it's got quite an open understory. There's quite a lot of space for the birds to fly around in this and forage. They forage a lot mostly in the canopy, but also off the bark as well. You can see that in this picture that there's a mixed age groups of trees. You can see some older trees and some younger trees there. So this is a very perfectly natural, nice oak woodland, of which we do have some looking like this on Dartmoor. But most of the Dartmoor oak woodlands, and probably actually a lot of Welsh and Scottish woodlands too, look more like this. Now this is a picture taken at a different time of year to the previous slide. It's not always winter looking, I can assure you. But what you see, so this picture is obviously taken earlier in the year, in late winter. And what you see here is the product of woodland management that was common throughout the UK's oak woods. And that is the woodland was managed to, it was coppiced, the oak was coppiced, so it was mostly cut down, but it's still alive, so it regrew. And and the harvested wood, the bark was used in the tanning industries. So in Dartmoor, we have what we call stannery towns around the edge of Dartmoor, like Ashburton, quite Fartley. Is still tans hides today. And the wood was used for making charcoal, which powered a lot of the copper and tin mines that were found around Dartmoor, for example. But this management ceased by sort of 1900, and since then, these woods have largely been left. And what we see today, what you see in this picture, is what we call an abandoned oak coppice. So all those coppice stalls, those multi-stemmed stalls, have regrown. And what you see here, in contrast to the previous slide, is woodland that's of a very even age. So all these trees are the same kind of age. And there's a lack of mature trees. There's a lack of nest sites for hole nesting birds. There's still some holes, but nowhere near as many. And it's these that have solved the problem. These is what you might call a cheap conservation intervention that works. The nest box, and it's putting up of nest boxes in these woodlands that has created these populations, certainly in the southwest, of pied flycatchers. So at Yarner Wood, the Dartmoor National Nature Reserve, where the study site that I work at, boxes were first put up there in the 1950s, and nest boxes were pretty new then. It was one of the earlier nest box schemes in the UK. These boxes weren't put up for pied flycatchers. Pied flycatchers hadn't even been recorded as a breeding bird on Dartmoor at that time. I think perhaps maybe 1952. I think technically, I think a pair was recorded breeding somewhere on Dartmoor, but they weren't breeding birds on Dartmoor at this time. And there was an experiment by the wardens there at the time to look at the height preferences of blue and great tits, which also use hole nesting and use these boxes. And they put these boxes up at two on each tree, different heights. And we're very surprised in that first year that they had a pair of pied flycatchers using one of these boxes. And the adults and the young were ringed. And the following year, at least one of those adults came back and nested again, and the population took off from there. And when this experiment finished a few years later, they kept one tree on each box, provided a lot more nest boxes across the wood, and the population slowly grew. And it grew even more rapidly in the late 70s and early 80s when lots of other nest box schemes were started up across Dartmoor. Endleswood to begin with, and lots around Oakhampton, and then in the Tean Valley, and that sort of continues today. And the population was at a very high level around 1990 in particular. Probably partly a product of all these boxes going up. Population has declined a bit since 1990, although it has levelled off perhaps at a lower level in the last 7 years or so. And then these nest boxes have been great. So I'm going to take you around this slide wise very briefly, just to introduce my work and the rest of this talk. But these nest boxes are great for the birds because they provide these holes in these woodlands that are in low abundance otherwise. These nest boxes are designed so that they are pretty safe for the birds. So, we make them out of oak, for example. So squirrels have trouble getting in, and woodpeckers don't peck through them until they're really old. And these boxes last for decades. These oak boxes, so they're great for the birds because they're pretty safe, predator-proof, and they're great for people like myself as well. It means that we can study large numbers of nests. When you remember where you put the nest boxes, you can monitor large numbers of nests pretty easily, and it means that inspect the content weekly, as we do, with minimal interference, and we can capture the adults very easily, which we tend to do with when they've got nestlings, to ring them as part of our research, part of licensed work, ringing them, and ring the chicks as well. So they're great. And in my work, I've been able to use all the historic nest recording that's been going on since the 1950s. So I'm taking to the top right there, that's a picture taken from a report by one of the wardens in the 60s. So I've been able to use this historical data, and this has enabled us to look back in time. A lot of my work is based around changing climate, for example. So that's become a particularly valuable data set to use. Climate change wasn't on the agenda when these nest boxes went up, but this provides unique data to investigate things related to that. And my typical year these days is to start the field season in the beginning of April when the first birds arrive, to quantify the arrival dates of males to particular territories, which is their nest boxes, We do a lot of monitoring of invertebrates, again, part of this climate change work. I won't be talking too much about that today, but we monitor their food, caterpillars and flying insects. And we monitor the nests all through the season. So we record the nest building phase and the egg laying phase, incubation, and the stages in the nest. And that's when we the adults. And on the left-hand side there, you see a tracking device. So I'll be talking a bit about that in a moment, about the tracking work we've been able to do of these adults. And that's taken us to working in Africa, where these birds winter, and the tracking work has taken us to a particular area of Africa that I'll talk about. As well as using all this information collected at East Dartmoor, we also make a lot of use of data collected across this whole network of nest box sites right across southwest England. So you've got about 50 sites here. And these days, that's about 3,000 nest boxes that are monitored by citizen scientists. So every single one of these box schemes is monitored by usually a small group of citizen scientists who monitor the boxes, visit these boxes weekly, which enables us to see when they start nest building, when they lay their first egg, which is an important measure to look at their time of breeding, see how many eggs they lay, how many hatch, and how many fledge. Many of these monitors are licensed bird ringers or connected to a licensed bird ringer who ring a very, very large proportion of the birds across the network. And although adult birds are very faithful to the same woodlands, they return to the same one each year. The young recruit into they do recruit into the population they were born into, the wood they were born into, but they also commonly disperse further. And all of these nest box schemes are connected by dispersal of the young birds. And we've got a phenomenal amount of information about dispersal between and recruitment between all these populations. It's been a huge success. I never ever imagined it to take off in the way that it has and involve so many people. And you can see, I haven't put the boundary of Dartmoor National Park on here, but that collection right in the middle there, where the density is highest, is the Dartmoor, and you can see the schemes cover pretty much all of the oak woodland of Dartmoor and also of Exmoor at the top there. Just to cherry pick an example of the value of bird ringing, this is an exceptional example. This is a female bird that we have really an incredibly complete life history for. And this bird happened to be one of the oldest UK pied flycatchers on record. It was 10 days short of the record, and unfortunately we weren't able to beat it, but we got very close. There's a lot of text in this, but the sort of points I want to make is that we ring this bird as a nestling, a very small nest box scheme above Manhattan, and we captured it as an adult, the breeding adult, the following year, which is when we found out it was a female at Ghana Wood, and we caught it every single year that we assume it was alive. We assume it didn't make it back in 2019. We know every single male that we caught, every single male that it paired with. We know its first egg date, which is the first date in the brackets there, every year. We knew how many eggs she laid every year. We know how many have fledged each year. And we know how many of those fledglings have gone on to become breeding birds themselves. So this is really is quite incredible. And we can see that she bred with 8 different males. So there was one male she bred with twice. But so this shows that it illustrates that they're not actually faithful to the same partner year to year. But if you look at the nest box numbers, they're not faithful to the same nest box either, but these nest box numbers are very similar to each other. And I know where all these, this is all imprinted very much in my memory about where all these nest boxes are. And all these boxes that she bred in are very close to each other. So it's the same part of Ghana Wood they return to, but not necessarily the same box. You notice in 2016, she did actually breed somewhere else. She bred about 12 kilometres away in the Tees Valley. I can't explain that. That's quite unusual. But it was nice to know that she did that. And we only know that from the Pied Fly network monitoring that they're in this other woodland. You can see that in her later years, in her last year, for example, in 2018, more than half of her eggs didn't hatch. I can't tell you exactly why that would be, but perhaps it's because she's getting old and senescing towards the end of her life there. But of all these breeding attempts, all of them were successful in producing at least one young. She laid 62 eggs, 46 of which fledged. And as far as we know, just one of those recruited to become a breeding bird themselves. So this female has achieved her evolutionary objective of passing on her genes to another generation. It's possible that some of these other offspring recruited to populations outside of the southwest, but most recruitment would probably be to the southwest. So there's a cherry-picked, very good example of how useful this, or how much information this ringing data provides. And we have this for thousands of individuals. Most individuals will last 2 or 3 years old rather than the 9 that this one did. The one thing that bird ringing hasn't enabled us to learn very much about is about their migration. And because they're so easy to ring, lots of them are ringed in the UK. About 750,000 of them have been ringed in the last 100 years or so in the UK. But of these, only 6 have been found south of the Sahara. In fact, only 4 of those during the proper wintering period of time. The other 2 were probably on passage in Senegal. So we've got very little information from that. The map actually shows those 4, and also one of which was from Oak Cantons. And it shows you that across Europe, where millions have been ringed, in fact, there's only 12 that have been found in the wintering grounds during the wintering period. So the risk ringing data also provides us with only a snapshot of information. All these 12 were I think, found dead by people reported in Africa. So we don't have any information about their migration routes or the migration timings and lots of things like that. It's limited in this sense. Very useful in the breeding grounds for looking at survival and those life histories, but not very useful for looking at migration. Until recently, and I've been very lucky actually, my career's timed very nicely with the miniaturization of tracking technology, which does now enable us to track birds as small as pied flycatchers. It's all very pioneering. When I first got involved in this back in 2012, really we're testing these tags out in the early years. It's only in the last few years that this has kind of worked out a lot better. So the sort of tags we're using, see in the top left there, it's called a geolocator. And it's just, you can see the light reflecting off the light sensor. So these are data loggers that just record light levels. From this we can estimate, light shows us when the time of sunrise and sunset, and therefore midday, and we can estimate where on the globe the bird was on each day, and the equinoxes. So these tags are so small, these only weigh 0.36 grams in that harness there. So they're too light to carry a big battery to transmit this data. They don't transmit it, they store it. And for us to be able to get this data, we have to recapture the bird the year after. But it is biased towards birds that survive. You don't get any information from birds that die in that time. We managed to get tracks from 50 individuals now. And if you work that out, that's equivalent to the knowledge gained from ringing more than 6 million pied flycatchers. So the analysis of this has been long and arduous, but we are quite close to finishing this now. This is a plot from these tracks. This is an example, typical plot. This is done by Fraser, my PhD student, who's has been analysing this, now writing it up. And you can see the blue line there is the autumn migration, and you can see that those dots stop over. So in the autumn, that's now. So so what they do after departing here is they stop in Iberia, particularly on the sort of western side, of Portugal, and that's where our Dartmoor breeding flycatchers are now, and they'll be there for the next 2 weeks. We didn't know of this stopover. Well, we knew that birds went through Spain from bird ringing recoveries recovered there, but we didn't know they spent any length of time there. They spent about 2 weeks there. before travelling over the Sahara, which I'll talk about again in a moment. And they stop briefly after the crossing and then make their way to their final wintering area, or breeding area, I should technically call it, in a pretty small area of Western Africa. Think about that distribution across Western Central Africa. All of our UK flycatchers are going to a pretty small area of Western Africa. The orange line is the spring migration, which is shorter and faster, and they just make one stop here, generally in Northern Africa, possibly in Iberia, before coming back. So those birds are making this journey across the Sahara twice a year. The Sahara looks something like this, and pied flycatchers are woodland birds. There's no trees on the Sahara, so it's been quite a mystery how do these birds cross such a barrier, so it's so difficult to survive this with the heat and the landscape. And the schools of thought were that they could potentially fly non-stop using their fat reserves that they build up before they make these migrations, or perhaps they, in the daytime, drop down into an oasis or any area of shade and sit out the day and then migrate again at night. We know birds do tend to migrate at night. Not only is it cooler, there are also less predators. So there was these different schools of thought about how these birds may cross the Sahara, and we can see from the geolocator data exactly how they do it. So this has now been solved for pied flycatchers and for other birds that have been tracked away. Different species have different strategies, but quite a common strategy, and the one that the pied flycatcher uses, is to migrate non-stop. So it will start its migration across the Sahara sometime after dark, and it will fly for the rest of that night. It will keep on flying throughout the whole of the next day and the whole of the next night, and they'll probably be over the other side sometime early in that following day. That's about 38 hours, I think is something like the average flight time that it takes to cross. So that's quite an impressive feat for a bird that only weighs 12, 13 grams. And actually, we also see that in the autumn, the migration route is along the western edge of the desert. So not over the sea, as the slide implied. It's probably following the coastline of Africa, where it's still inhospitable, but perhaps a little bit of an easier journey than right across. But they do go right across in the spring, when there's more need to arrive back to their breeding sites as early as they can. So when they do arrive in the UK and back into Dartmoor, they tend to arrive at night or in the early hours of the morning. Usually pretty subdued for that first day they arrive back. But after about a day, you'll start hearing the males singing. They'll be singing from the treetops pretty much all day, but especially in the morning, where they're trying to attract the females. Now then, at Yarner Wood, with the wardens there, and in more recent years, wardens plus bird watchers and myself and others have been recording the first arrival date, when the day the first male is seen, and they're pretty conspicuous at this time. There's no leaves on the trees, and they're singing. So it's a pretty reliable estimate of when the first one arrives. And you can see that they're actually arriving about 2 weeks earlier compared to the 1960s. And this, I'm pretty sure, is in response to climatic change, which has made springs a lot earlier than they used to be. Because pied flycatchers are very reliant on a short period of time when there's lots of insects available for their young. Those insects emerge earlier in these earlier warmer springs as well. So they do need to arrive earlier to be able to breed earlier too. So the males migrate just a little bit before the females. So the females are harder to see, and they're not singing. So it's quite hard to figure out when the females arrive precisely, although our tracking data does give us some clues to this. And females tend to arrive a few days after the first male. So probably sort of 2 or 3 days after the first male is seen, we'll start seeing the first females. And the females go around the wood, um, checking out all these different males. And the females will check out a surprisingly large number of males. The males will probably hold 1 or 2 nest boxes territory at the beginning, less as more birds pile in. And if a female's checking out a male, the male's behaviour changes. And I wish more people would spend the time to observe this, because this is one of my favourite moments of the spring, when you realise the female is in the vicinity, because the male behaves quite differently. He's much more lively, and his song changes, much more high-pitched and quicker. And he'll go inside the nest box and he'll sing from inside this different song from inside the nest box. The female will go inside and check out, presumably, the nest box. Already checked him out, see how good his plumage is, how good his song is, and eventually she'll select one of these males, and they'll probably start nest building on that same day. And they nest build pretty. And then they'll start laying. They'll probably wait for the cue to laying, which we assume is something related to temperature, probably through vegetation or food. And pied flycatchers lay an egg a day until they complete their first clutch. And if we look at when they lay their first egg, this is a great measure of timing of breeding. It's something we're very interested in for our work, looking at the effect of climate change. And like arrival date, their first egg laying date has become a lot earlier. And since the 1950s, it's pretty much 2 weeks earlier, showing that they're tracking this advance in spring, at least to an extent, quite a big extent. 2 weeks is quite a long time in such a short period of time. So then, so they lay their eggs. They want 1 per day. Their average clutch size in the southwest is just over 7. They incubate the eggs for about 15, 16 days, and they all hatch on the same day. On the left here, you've got some nestlings that I'd say are probably 2 or 3 days old, and they're in the nest for about 15, 16 days old. And those chicks, those larger chicks you see on the right, then this is the age we tend to ring them at when they're older. These are, I'd hazard a guess, are probably about 12 days old or so. That, by the way, that strange ball at the bottom of the right-hand picture, this picture was taken by David Price, who captures the adults in the nest boxes by using these squash balls, which he puts in the box, and when the parent wants is in there, he's there at the other end of the piece of string and blocks the hole so he can capture the visual that he wants. So after they're fledged, the nest box is still dependent on their parents for another couple of weeks. You never see, despite the fact I spend so much time in the woods at this time, at fledging time, once they leave the nest, I almost never see family parties being fed by the adults. I mean, perhaps I don't look hard enough. But presumably they're in the canopy, not moving very much, pretty quiet, and just fed to independence for another week there. The adults start molting at this time, molting their flight feathers, ready for their autumn migration. Again, showing the same slide as before, the blue line here. So we can see from the tracking data that the adults are leaving in July, towards the end of July. The young, we haven't been able to track. It's not possible to track the youngsters yet. It's not possible to know how large they are to get the harness size right at the right moment. So we don't know when the when the juveniles leave, but it's probably a week or 2 after the adults, I would imagine. So I'm now taking you down to Africa through Spain and Portugal and over the Sahara, and then down into that bit of Western Africa there, where you see the darker blue there. And because we're interested in understanding what drives these populations, not just in the breeding grounds where they're really well studied, but in these wintering areas where we don't really know much about what they do at all. And we've been doing some work with Fraser, who you see in this picture here, and that's Emmanuel you see from the BirdLife partner in Liberia. So we've been doing some work in Liberia over a few winter seasons. We've just finished. We just evacuated our last member of staff out the week before. It was only a week earlier, thankfully, due to the COVID nightmare. But we managed to complete the field work. And what we see here is we've been working in 2 different sites. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea about what their habitat looked like in their wintering areas. So this is a more natural site, if you like, what we might consider a more sort of natural, pristine habitat for them. In the background there, you've got in shade, but it's pristine forest. In the foreground, you can see these grasses growing, which is after it's been burnt. So this is what we call sort of savanna grassland or savanna forest. So in between the dense forest and the savanna grassland, you've got these isolated trees, and that's where the birds are spending. That's where they're foraging. These are some of the key areas for them. We've been radio tracking adult pied flycatchers here to see how big their territories are and where they're foraging and when during the day. And we can see that they're generally in the hot parts of the day, which is actually most of the day. They're spending it resting in the forest edge, the dense forest edge, and then they're coming out of the forest edge to feed in the morning and in the evening in these isolated trees and all sorts of things. The ants are clearly quite important. And the other place we've been working on them looks like this. Now, this is a farm. Most farms in this part of the world have trees that provide some level of shade like this. So perhaps the structure of this woodland is very similar to what I just showed you in the savannah, even if the species are very, very different. And they actually have very high densities of pied flycatchers in this habitat. This is what we might think of as much more degraded kind of habitat. And amongst the things we're looking at, as well as looking at the home ranges and radio tracking, we've done a lot of work looking at whether birds in this more degraded habitat, say we might have higher instances of infection by avian malaria, for example. So we've been sampling birds, looking for blood samples to look at the prevalence of avian malaria in these 2 different sites, contrasting sites, as well as doing it in the UK to see how the differs between them and how individual birds over their lifetime have multiple infections and things like that. And we can see how conditions in Africa perhaps might affect their ability to breed very as productively in the UK, for example. So that's work of Fraser, which is ongoing at the moment. That work has been delayed by COVID. So they spend, they're in those wintering areas from kind of middle of September to sometime in March, and then they make that spring migration back rapidly across the Sahara, stopping briefly in North Africa, and then going from there directly to their breeding sites back on Dartmoor. So perhaps this is a bird's eye view as one comes back in, even if they usually come in the evening, in the morning, sorry. And I can always go on, perhaps slightly abrupt end, but of course I must thank all these lovely organisations that have supported my work over the years. I should thank David Price, Tom Wallace, in particular, using some of their photographs in this slide, as well as all the many monitors and people who have this data over the years. Thank you for listening.